Let me bring up the three panelists. Marianne Wu from GE, Gil Friend, come on up. And is Diarmuid here? Oh my God, are we lucky today. I'm going to give each one a quick introduction, ask them to give us a quick minute. Marianne, I'd love to start with you. I do a lot of work with Marianne. She is a great friend, Stanford graduate, one of the senior venture capitalists in the Valley. She heads General Electric's venture efforts here. They're one of the most aggressive and successful strategic investors. She's a particular expert in IoT software digitization. Do you want to just give a quick 60-second overview, and then we'll come to Gil and to Diarmuid?
Perfect. Thanks, Steve, and thank you very much for being here and for the organizers for having us. I assume you guys are all familiar with General Electric. We're a large, diversified industrial. A couple things you may not, some things you probably know, but I was going to just give a quick overview. One, as you guys probably all know, our founding was Thomas Edison with the invention of the light bulb. So we are obviously a very large player in energy and have been from our inception. It is core to our blood. A couple factoids you may not know. 1/3 of all energy worldwide goes through GE systems today. So we are a major player from our birth to today, and a big focus for us. We also are unusual in terms of extending our footprint across the full value chain. So if you look at electricity, we're in generation where we have a very large position in renewables with wind, but we are also in the grid and distribution, transmission and distribution business, and in the building and consumption business. So very unusual in the extent that we play across the full value chain and also have a business in oil and gas. So very diversified across energy. And a lot of what Steve talked about tied back to digital and IoT, and GE's commitment to digital and digital industrial is enormous. Those of you who do spend some time watching TV have probably seen our commercials. But this is really important. There was a question about IoT before. We can spend more time on it later. But there's lots of productivity that can come from applying IT to make services better for customers, but also use energy much more efficiently. So these things are highly coupled. Just a very quick note about GE Ventures. We are certainly a corporate venture capital innovation investing arm for GE Ventures. But our real function is an innovation bridge to GE. And what we really serve, our purpose is really to take the innovation and the agility and the inventiveness of startups and find a way to marry that with the scale of GE so that we can really have impact across a broad business. We want that to be financially successful for the startups, but we also really want to deliver impact back into the business. So that's the business and the industry. So that's really the purpose we serve, and we can talk more about that as well.
Great. Thank you, Marianne. Gil Friend, someone else I've known for ages, Chief Sustainability Officer for the city of Palo Alto. And I think most of you understand most of the action today is happening in cities. He is running what may be one of the greenest cities in the country. I think Sid would agree with that as a former mayor. Founder and chairman of Natural Logic, inaugural member of the Sustainability Hall of Fame, author, Truth About Green Business. I love this, which John Elkington called the best green business guide I have read this century. Named one of the top 10 most influential sustainability voices in America. Gil, do you want to give us a quick 1-minute overview from the city?
Sure, Stephen, thank you. And thank you, everybody. Really delighted to be here with you today. Steve, as you know, for most of the past 25 years, I've worked advising some of the leading sustainability leading corporations in the world, HP, Levi Strauss, SunPower, and others, on making sustainability a strategic driver of exceptional business performance, driver of innovation, brand reducer of risk, and generator of profits and share value. When Palo Alto headhunted me, frankly, 3.5 years ago and said, come be our first CSO, I jumped at the opportunity for the reason that you said, because cities are at ground zero in this work. I mean, certainly Silicon Valley as a geographic location, but as an institution in the world, cities are out front here and in Europe and in Asia and in South America. And of course, Palo Alto as the iconic city that it is, the relationship with Stanford and with the Silicon Valley ecosystem offered an amazing opportunity to push the envelope and ask the question of what can one small city do to advance the sustainability revolution, not just in Palo Alto, but in the Bay Area as a whole, which we'll talk about a bit, and lend influence to the developments in the planet. So there's enormous opportunities with cities. There are some very deep challenges just in the way that local government runs to embrace the kind of opportunities that you sketched out so well.
Great. The next person I want to introduce is a really good friend, and I'm just excited to have him here because Diarmuid and I worked together at Tesla. And a lot of you think, oh, Tesla, you guys must be smart. That was just up and to the right the whole way. Not exactly. The firm almost went under a number of times. We've more twists in the road that I can tell you, lawsuits, Fisker. It was not easy. And entrepreneurs like Diarmuid that can take a company through that have done something truly extraordinary and have made history. Diarmuid's got an extraordinary background, Dartmouth undergrad, master's in foreign policy from UVA, business school in Chicago.
Not Stanford.
Well,
I don't know, man.
My biggest demerit in this valley.
But you've been going east to south, east to west, so you're making the right transition.
Pretty darn good. But the one thing I have to say is when we invested in Tesla, Tesla had 25 people working in a warehouse in San Carlos. Mm-hmm. And when I went and told my wife, we're investing in this company that's going to change the auto world. It's electric car company, warehouse, San Carlos, 25 people. She said, go get your money back now. Today, the firm has over 25,000 people. What you should know is Diarmuid is reported directly to Elon Musk that entire time. Elon, as you might know, has been running other companies, including SpaceX, which raises the question, who the heck is running things when he's gone? May I present Diarmuid O'Connell?
Thank you, Steve. And just one slight correction. The gentleman who gave me my first opportunity at Tesla and to whom I reported is actually the same gentleman who invited me here today. That's Mike Harrigan up there. So he was one of those first 25 and one of the pioneers of this effort. So a round of applause for Mike. Mike had foresight before anyone, I think, and should be credited for that. It's a pleasure to be here today. Such is the nature of Tesla that I actually get the opportunity to go out in the world and see the effect that the technologies that are being developed here today are having. I guess the good and the bad news is that there is tremendous traction for the full suite of sustainable, renewable, clean, however we want to characterize them, technologies out in the world, and the trajectory toward mass adoption is moving much more quickly in some of those markets than even here. There are populations and policymakers and leaders who are much more committed at national and regional levels in certain quarters of the U.S. in certain quarters of the world, even than they are here. But something that you say, Steve, I think that I find is universally true, and that is that while we can be obsessed by the headlines about what's happening with respect to international agreements and national policies and national politics, it is true that the most meaningful change is happening at the local level. And there you find the deep convictions around these technologies, whether it comes from an abiding interest in climate change, a more localized interest in the negative effects of the emissions generated by fossil-based technologies, the things that brought me to Tesla, which were more related to national security, or the things that were related to economic development and job creation and all of these themes. So, it's easy to get frustrated by macro headlines, and it's when you're actually in the trenches developing these technologies. There is a tension between this feeling that everything's moving very quickly and why can't we get this going faster, but that in the main there's tremendous momentum toward the implementation of all these technologies at a mass scale. I mean, that's really what's happened here, is that we've reached the price profile that allows these technologies not to simply be, as they've been characterized in past years, green indulgences available only to the wealthiest amongst us. But these are technologies that are ready for mass deployment, that are cost competitive with incumbent technologies, that make unnecessary, enormous, costly, and time-consuming investments in, I just heard you talk about nuclear, and that offer the opportunity to really go back to the future in empowering folks to manage a household wherein they are generating their own energy and managing it and using it entirely independently of any mass-scale production or transmission facility. And really, that's where we're headed. There was a poignant moment for me some years ago, and I think, Mike, you and I were still working together at San Carlos. The governor of Montana, this is some 8-9 years ago, governor of Montana, a guy named Brian Schweitzer, good guy, came in, and I was walking him around and preaching the good word of, sustainable generation and use and all this sort of stuff. And he said, very pragmatic guy, I was just talking to my granddad, who, and I was telling him about this brave new world, and he said, oh yeah, we used to have that down on the ranch. And he said, what are you talking about? He's like, oh yeah, we had a windmill, and we had some lead acid batteries, and that's how we generated our electricity. It had a couple of problems with intermittency. Couldn't run the power tools as frequently as you like. But in a way, what's happening here is a descaling of an industrial scale energy generation ecosystem empowered by the technologies that are being developed around us right now, whether it's information technology or storage and generation and use. So with that, I will get off the podium or get off the soapbox and be responsive to your questions.
We'll take orders. No.
Yes, I'm happy to take orders.
Marianne, I have to ask.
I was just going to actually, before you get to the question, I was
it.
just going to amplify this point because I do feel like there may be some concerns and some frustrations about what's happening in D.C. and some policy changes that or positioning stances that have come, certainly. And as Steve said, and as Diarmuid reiterated again, the train has really left a station on this. So I think fundamentally the economics, policy does matter, yes, in the margin policy matters, but fundamentally, if you look underneath the policy, economics really matter and customer preferences really matter. And those two things have fundamentally changed. So if you look at overall fuel mix, we've been going coal to natural gas for a very long time. Now the biggest driver inside of that, Steve talked about new growth. The biggest new installs each year are solar. That train has left the station. So coal to natural gas to electrification, where that electrification is increasingly from renewables, that's done. And then consumer preference is certainly we see at the epicenter in a place like California. Consumer preference choices are very clear, but we see this on a global basis. So those two fundamental drivers dictate the direction the industry heads. There's little changes and blips that happen with policy, but those are the two fundamental drivers, and that train has fundamentally left the station.
Left the station, has been leaving for a long time. You talked about some of the initiatives in California. We've been on the renewable and energy efficiency path for about 45 years now, seeing the successes of it every day. So the policy question isn't whether Washington is going to slow down this revolution. The policy question is whether the United States is going to surrender leadership to China and Germany for the economy of the 21st century. That's our policy issue.
This is great. I have a self-driving panel. I love it. So, Gil, I have to ask, and again, I've known Gil for I think 20 years plus. Yeah. You all know what Tesla does. You all know what GE does. I'd just like to submit the action that's occurring by cities and states is dramatic. And I would love to ask you, Gil, what are the one or two things you've done in Palo Alto that are most impactful? And then maybe choose one or two other mayors around the world that you think are really doing game-changing stuff.
Sure. Well, Palo Alto has been on the sustainability path for a long time. It operates the only full-service municipally owned utility in the state of California. Gives us enormous leverage. Our council last month unanimously passed a new sustainability and climate action plan. We did one of the first in the country in 2005, I think it was. And this plan sets a goal of 80% reduction in greenhouse gases, kind of the gold standard around the world, but we're shooting for 2030. Not for 2050. It sounds crazy, but we're already at about 37%. largely achieved through taking our electricity production carbon neutral. Our portfolio is now about 60% renewables, 40% hydro. Maybe some instability in hydro, depending on how you think climate is going, but there you go. So that's a big accomplishment. One of the authorities that local government has in California is building codes. So we've got an aggressive green building ordinance with an energy reach code that's pitched about 15 or 20% more aggressive than the state of California's, which is already the most aggressive in the United States. And that kind of gives you a flavor of Palo Alto. We kind of like to be out front. Starting to go into a new code cycle now. The next big move, Council authorized earlier this year, and it takes effect July 1st. We're going to buy offsets for all of our natural gas production. In effect, making Palo Alto Utilities a carbon neutral utility, taking our greenhouse gas emissions, if you count offsets, down about 64% from 1990 levels, which is pretty cool. But of course, offsets people have a lot of questions about. And we very clearly see offsets not as a solution, but as a bridge strategy. First of all, to use our money to drive emissions down somewhere on the planet faster than we can economically. But even more importantly, we see the offsets not as buying indulgences, but as a capital formation vehicle to invest not just in methane plants at dairy farms in Minnesota or forests in Madagascar, but where Council has stipulated to prioritize local offsets. Peninsula, Bay Area, California. So to the extent that we can find qualifiable, certifiable, meets all the standards offsets here, we have some money to start investing in driving those things down. The third area of significance for us, about 2/3 of our current carbon emissions, is transportation. And for those of you who don't know, Palo Alto is a city of 66,000 people. In the evening, in the daytime, it's 148,000 people. It's an enormous pulse of commuters coming in, most of them driving single occupancy, fossil fuel powered vehicles. So our big challenge is how do we move that? And clearly, as a tiny city in a big metro, we don't get to do that by ourselves. This has to be a team sport. So we're working with a dozen other cities and several major employers, including Microsoft, on a variety of new mobility alternatives funded by the Federal Transit Administration that we hope can not only test ways to, in a nutshell, make it more convenient for anybody, anywhere, at any time to not have to get into a car and drive. And if we can get measurable reductions in single occupancy vehicle use there, and of course help accelerate the shift to electric vehicles, we think we can help generate a constellation of political will in the Bay Area that perhaps can shift state policy on transportation.
Great. So, Diarmuid, at Tesla, we never dreamed that when we put out the first Model S, it would rather quickly or fairly quickly become #1 selling luxury model in the world, ahead of any single model at BMW or Mercedes. It's stunning. But we were parodied for being a plaything of the rich. Fast forward 36 months, not a long time, and you're about to put the Model 3 on the market. I suspect it's going to be a big seller, but as the cost of batteries comes down, do you foresee, how far down do you think the cost of lithium-ion batteries will go? Does it get down to, $150, $100, and do you see $20,000, $25,000 electric vehicles in the future?
Well, one slight correction, then a comment, and then an answer. We did dream that would be the case. I don't think that we were quite as certain that we were going to be able to become the leading premium vehicle in that segment as quickly as we did do, and not well known to the public. In the U.S., but also in certain European markets, the Model S outsells all of its parity cars. So the Mercedes S-Class, the Audi A8, the BMW 7 Series, and even some of the vehicles below that. And it's actually that competitive fact that has inspired Mercedes and Audi and BMW to get into the EV space. And this was actually part of the original thesis, which is that unsuccessful in selling powertrains to, or projected to be unsuccessful selling powertrains to car makers who had no interest in making electric vehicles. The most obvious way to spur the market forward was to create the market, to create that sliver of a wedge in the total sales, total auto sales around the world, and then make it so attractive that others pile in. So it has really been a notable thing that we're out competing these folks. An editorial note that I haven't survived with Elon for 11 years because I got out in front of him with the media or with the SEC on projecting costs. But it is the case that without endorsing your numbers, that battery costs are coming down at a truly impressive rate. It's never has been, nor will it ever be, probably Moore's law. But we're getting to the point where a lot of third parties are saying that EVs, pound for pound parity vehicles are going to be cheaper than their internal combustion counterparts in the very near future. And we're talking, just a couple of single-digit years, not decades. I am incredibly impressed by how quickly the public sentiment has moved to electric vehicles just in the last 12 months. And I think some of that has been the entry of some of the major name brand companies with whom we've worked over the course of time, but who even as we worked with them, it was clear that they didn't have a conviction, but now they have a conviction and now they're getting in. And there's always been this thesis that there'll be a tipping point for electric transportation, and I think that tipping point is closer and closer. It inexorably moves in because the only thing that's preventing adoption at this point is availability, and availability is going to start to get solved within the next, in our case, within the next year, and in the case of others, very soon thereafter. So it's a very exciting time for electric mobility, but it's also an exciting time because there are all these companion technologies that are expanding people's imagination of what the transportation infrastructure of the future looks like, whether it's connectivity or autonomy or shared services, the other three major vectors in this business. When you combine them all and they're fully realized, I think you are going to get to the things that we all care about at a local level, which is lower congestion, lower cost of use, total cost of ownership, total cost of use of mobility. Does it even make sense to own a car if it's anything other than a sentimental ownership experience? And then also, and importantly, and I mentioned it before, the issue of local emissions. They're around the world, but even in the most affluent communities in America, the incidence of asthma is rising, even as the use of tobacco is falling. Lung disease and so forth, and this is all related to the fact that we still have an incredible and very dangerous emissions profile. Some progressive work was done here in the 70s and 80s in California, but we now have the technologies to fully realize the dreams of the folks who lived in the LA basin and were choking in the 50s and 60s, which is to move to a zero emissions profile. And this one of the statistics you cite is emblematic of that. As the grid has become cleaner, the percentage of emissions coming from transportation is greater by relative measurement, and so. I would suggest that the problem is greater. And the one thing I'll conclude by saying, I think that while a lot of us come to this from the perspective of global warming and climate change and so forth, and that is all true, it's not as proximate in people's lives as their need to get from point A to point B, or the fact that their child suffers from asthma, or they know someone who's had a lung disease. And we should, just as we're talking about catalysts at the local level, we should be talking about, redefining the problems that are going to help us accelerate the change to things like, wouldn't it be great if we had lower emissions? Wouldn't it be great if we didn't have this soot descending on our gardens and flowers and homes if we live close to, as so many Californians do, major thoroughfares? So,
Wouldn't it be great if we didn't have to commute 2 and 3 hours to work, which means that our companies, including yours and ours and probably many in the room here, have a hard time keeping employees? or even hiring employees who say, yeah, we want to come work with you. They come check it out and say, no way am I going to move here because because congestion is so miserable. So multiple problems. One of the things I think you may have skipped in the opportunities, Diarmuid, is vehicle-to-grid technologies and the impact that the transportation revolution is going to have on the electrical utility industry, something that we struggle with in a very practical way. One of the things I love about Tesla's trajectory and all this is not that you just dreamed about these things, but you actually published a secret plan, 10, 12 years ago, where you said, start with a fancy, expensive, high-end roadster, and then do a luxury car. You didn't know you were going to capture that whole market, but you moved down from 120 into the 70s, and then an SUV in the 50s and 60s, and then a competitive family sedan in the 30s. That was not secret. That was just laid out on the table by you guys decades ago, and it's been fascinating to watch you just move through that plan. And for me, I don't say that just to praise you, but to raise one of the challenges that we have as a city government, where there's one kind of planning that is extrapolative. Look at what the past trends have been, assume they're going to continue, and do the little bit that you can to move along the trend, sort of locked in what looks like present feasibility. Yep. And there's another approach that says, what do the exponential or highly variable trends look like? Where might we be going? Even more importantly, where do we want to be? What's the future that we want to invent? And then figure out how to design it and actually, like NASA did with the Apollo mission, reverse engineer the trajectory. Where do we want to get to and how did we get there? And then use that to plot tomorrow's moves. It's a very different approach.
I love that. And so Marianne, I'm dying to put you on the spot just a little bit. My whole life, our whole lives, the highest market cap companies in the world for the last 50 years have been 6 oil companies, 3 car companies, and occasionally U.S. Steel, sometimes GE. But we're moving from an internal combustion era, an oil era, to an electricity era. And you're the biggest electricity manufacturer in the world. How does GE take advantage of it, and what do you think are the hot spaces out there that you're trying to get headquarters and so on to move forward on?
Yeah, no, great question. I do want to, this self-driving panel, I do want to sort of come to some of the points that have already been mentioned. And I think one of the underlying points, overarching underlying, I'm not sure, points that we're all trying to make on this panel is that green products are better. So if you look at, I think Steve had that, we talked about Tesla a lot, so let's just stick with electric vehicle. If you look at the chart that Steve had early on in his presentation with the EV1 and the Model S, part of the reason the Model S was so successful was it was a better car that was cost competitive in its market segment. So it wasn't more expensive in its market segment. You could argue it was cheap for a luxury car, and it was a better car. So you weren't making trade-offs. And I think that's the fundamental point that we're all talking about here is there used to be a fundamental trade-off that green was worse in some way, right? It was more expensive. It didn't perform as well. You had to really embrace it in a way that was against your financial best interest, your industrial best interest in terms of moving an economy forward. What flipped overnight, and I think Tesla did spur a certain amount of action on the vehicle industry part, is that fundamental trade-off that was in people's heads, that green is worse in some way, and I only do it because I care about the environment, I only do it because of some other overarching interest, that's all gone because it's just better business. Solar is cheaper, it is deployed. Electric vehicles are better in a luxury price segment coming down into mainstream market segments. You make those choices because they're better for you, bar none, right? No, because I care about X, Y, Z.
Well, I think one of our biggest challenges is that most people don't know that yet. I mean, we know that.
Right,
Folks
we
who are
know
immersed
that.
in it know
Right.
that. But we talk with, whether it's with people in local government in my present situation or as Natural Logic working with our clients, the assumption is still there.
Absolutely.
For most people, there's a trade-off. The data doesn't support it.
Absolutely.
The successes that we're seeing
and we're still very
but
early days, right? We're still very early days in that. But that's, I think, the fundamental point that we're all trying to drive across this. And so I think the vehicle example is very clear. We know it. We're all in the Bay Area, we see these Teslas driving everywhere and maybe own them, so we know them. But I think that's true across the industrial sector as well. You look at wind energy, that's centralized renewables, the reason that's deployed is because it's cheaper. It was the lowest cost of wholesale power. We're seeing that shifting to solar, backed up by storage. If you look at the contracts that are in place today, solar and storage are among the cheapest sort of sources of power coming into the wholesale system. So you've seen the system. We at GE have the, I don't know, privilege, I guess, of seeing the system flip in terms of the dynamics all the way through generation, transmission, kind of distribution, and consumption. So what does that mean? The reason the whole energy chain will change is because we've talked about the consumer preference. It's also showing up for utilities. So this is not a hypothetical thing for them. Some of you may have heard of the duck curve. But the main point is that when solar or wind, but solar in particular, is a high part of your generation, which it already is, it's the largest source of installs today, or when you have EV adoption that's significant, you have a lot of changes on your grid. So an EV, when it's charging, it's a big load. It looks like 3 houses all at once. It's sort of coming on. If you have short and intense, if you have solar, it generates for a window, it falls off. That's when people turn their air conditioning on, right? You have these things that fundamentally, that are happening. They're not going away. These are fundamental stressors on the system. So they need solutions for those problems as well. So the consumer and the generation sources drive this change, but it means everything in between will fundamentally disrupt. So we will see new grid technologies that come on that can change the way the system responds. So fundamentally today you have a generator, you don't even know about it, power comes out of your outlet, you don't know anything that's happening, it's one way, it's stupid. That whole system will become dynamic and it'll be like the internet. Power will flow, it'll be dynamic, the best, matching will occur in real time. We're gonna see increased electrification, certainly we've already seen this. And the other thing that we're gonna see is integration of energy into other products, right? So electric vehicle is a car. It also has a lot of intersection back into the grid in terms of how energy is consumed. You as a customer don't care. You just want a car, or maybe in the future you just want a ride. But that is going to fundamentally connect back into the energy system in a way that changes flows, that matters, but you as a customer may not care. So you may see that instantiated only through products and services. I'll give one example that goes, because I know you wanted to talk about this, so I'll self-cue. I'll give one example that goes back to lighting. And so GE, our founding is with Edison and the founder of the light bulb. Today we probably don't think, I can't imagine you guys think about lights very much, right? They're on, they light space, they're ubiquitous. But one of the things we're talking about is a shift towards solid state. Electric, that things are moving towards from thermal to solar, from towards batteries, and light bulbs are shifting to LED. And LED is better, it has better light quality, has better lifetime. It also is ubiquitous and powered, so you can put a little processor in there, you can put some sensors in there, and you can start to control your lighting in ways that help you be more productive as a worker. You can also start to pay attention, you can also censor what's happening in an overall physical environment. So that a building serves to exist a purpose as a theater, as a workplace, as a factory. If you know more about how your workers feel, how your inventory is flowing through a factory, you can optimize your overall business entity of being there. And that can be facilitated through lighting. So GE is doing that with one of its newest business units, Current, which I was fortunate enough to be part of the founding team as we kicked it off internally. But we're transforming lighting, which you don't even think about, as the backbone of an intelligent system that operates within the context of a building. And that's what we're seeing overall, the shifting of infrastructure into service provisioning. And you'll see that increasingly blending.
We've got 5 minutes left. I've got a super quick question, Gil, for you, as quick as you can. And Diarmuid, if there's time left, maybe one question from the audience. Gil, we all need more heroes. And Canada just elected a dynamic, young president with a green agenda. France just elected Macron, a similar sustainability, millennial-focused agenda. Are there
And
one
who's
or
invited us all to move to France and work on
Yeah.
climate change there.
I know
And
the
Canada's
U.S.
recruiting constantly
We
as
didn't
well.
quite get that memo. Are there one or two mayors that you think are real heroes that we should be looking at? Who are they? What are they doing?
There's not one or two, there's probably 300. 300 mayors signed on to the climate mayor's refutation of the U.S. withdrawal from Paris last week. 60 some odd million people, governors representing 36% of the U.S. GDP, more than 800 CEOs. So there's a lot of cities in motion. We're members of a thing called the Urban Sustainability Directors Network, which is 150 North American cities who are on this path together, doing collaborative competition together. But if you wanted me to pick out a few by name, I would start with Michael Bloomberg in New York, Eric Garcetti in Los Angeles, their CSO and sustainability teams. Daley in Chicago was out front, certainly on green roofs and green buildings. But I'm a little uncomfortable trying to single people out because there are so many. There is innovation at large and small cities across the country, sometimes in places you at least expect. Community of 15,000 in South Dakota that's doing some of the best urban agriculture work of anywhere in the country. So the opportunity here is to both, as I said, collaborative competition, compete because mayors and other electeds are competitive by nature. And one of the greatest motivators say, hey, wait a minute, they're doing that, why aren't we doing that? But the other is the opportunity to learn from each other, share best practices, take sustainability as a team sport, and really elevate the game for all of us.
Great. Diarmuid, U.S., Europe, clearly moving toward electric vehicles, I think faster than people think because you're helping to drive the cost down. But the energy future of the planet probably depends a lot more on China and India. What do you see happening there in terms of electric vehicles? How quickly can they move?
Well, the Chinese government is already moving very quickly. They have a political system that lends itself to that sort of dynamic movement. And so, our success there this past year is a testament to what's happening more broadly in that market. It needs to get organized a little bit. There are too many car companies, and that needs to get sorted out. But they're going to go very fast. The situation in India is a little bit different. They've made a very singular commitment to, I think by 2030, nothing other than electric vehicles can be sold in India, but there are some infrastructure issues that actually are probably gating factors for widespread deployment of electric vehicles, which lend themselves more to some of the technologies that are already widespread and well developed there, which on the generation side, so wind and solar. But storage, I think, is a key facilitating technology there to solve what is not just a structural problem, but creates the opportunity to facilitate that movement toward EVs. I think in Europe now that the major manufacturers are the leading manufacturers, which is to say the Germans, and then add in Renault, who's been really fashion forward on EVs. I think Europe is going to go very fast for all sorts of reasons. There is a deep and abiding feeling about sustainability and climate change that simply doesn't exist in the U.S. more broadly than in the Bay Area and a couple of other nodes, for what it's worth. So that goes fast. And I think, I'll leave you just with one thought, and which is that I think if we don't somehow figure out ways to spur adoption of electric vehicles in the U.S. is going to be a laggard with respect to EVs against other major markets, and that would be an unfortunate thing from an economic and industrial perspective.
We have time for one question from the audience, and then we're out of here. The gentleman in the back, you are dying to ask something. Tell us the question and who you'd like to direct it to. Diarmuid, you run government affairs. You should.
It's real simple. We need to price carbon in our economy, and we need to do it globally. There have been all sorts of, I want to say half-assed, but there have been a number of stillborn efforts in this regard. The whole business with cap and trade was an unfortunate and way too complicated to communicate clearly exercise in trying to achieve the same thing. I think that there's actually approximate opportunity in that, to the extent that you need to fund major government programs, whether it's infrastructure, healthcare, or whatever, you've got a very obvious opportunity with pricing carbon and generating revenues in that respect to essentially have a balanced system whereby we are pricing carbon, and that results in certain decisions that are made at the point of purchase, but that those benefits actually come back sometimes in a financial way to the same folks who are paying those things. So we're very encouraged by some rhetoric around carbon pricing right now, but as yet there are no viable policies or plans.
Well, there are some. They're not necessarily here, but this is a very real practical concern for us. As a city, we are handcuffed by the state, for example, in our energy initiatives and our green building regulations, to only require what is demonstrably cost effective, using cost effectiveness analysis tools that are kind of clunky, but also use the $10 or $12 carbon price that's extant in California. The Obama administration was using a $35 price. Sweden, we just met with the ambassador a couple of weeks ago, said $120 per ton price. As a policy decision, not an economic decision, they said if we want to move to a carbon-free society, we have to set the economic playing field in a way that will work. So I think the question for us is, it's clearly not going to come from Washington anytime soon. Is this something that can be done at the level of the state of California? We're not waiting for that. We're exploring the question of, is it something we can do at the level of a city? We don't know if we have the statutory authority, legal basis to do it, but we're looking at that. And while we're looking at that, the first step that we're going to hopefully take in this next year is to start price carbon internally in the city's own analysis of its own work, as Microsoft and a number of other companies have done. To start
Great.
And I'll
give
just
that
say
some reality.
actually one thing on this. So I think carbon pricing is natural, right? It's the one that takes all the factors into account. It is definitely additive to what we have today.
Yep.
So I think your point is, are we at risk in any way? And I do think there are incentives that are definitely useful today. There's incentives around solar, the incentives around EV, clean emissions regulation on vehicles. Those are things to watch for. There's a lot of rhetoric. There seems to be no movement on any of those things.
Watch for and fight for.
Watch for and fight for. I think the other thing that can happen, and this is what I sort of wanted to really focus on, is to the extent that people start to get in denial that we really are on an economically driven transition, we can just sort of get lackadaisical of that and have a certain amount of malaise. And so that's really up to everybody in the room to understand where we are on this very clear forward journey and keep commitment around that, and just understand in terms of our own commercial plans that it's really financially driven, clearly good for business, clearly good for consumers, and keep framing it in that mindset.
Great. We're a bit over time. We've got an extraordinary rest of the day planned for you. Can we hear a round of applause for the panelists?